Last year, when Western Africa was in the throes of the worst Ebola outbreak that the world had ever seen, the Congo was also grappling with the virus. Dr. Kabange Numbi, DRC's Minister for Health, had the duty of informing the nation that once again it was facing a recurrence of Ebola. It was assumed by many at the time that the Ebola outbreak in the DRC had spread from West Africa. The cause this time around, he tells me, is a familiar one to the Congolese.
Kulikuwa ante moya ama mwindaji aliendaka na alikuwa na nyama ya makaka, na ni kweli ule makaka alimkuta anesha kufa porini, akambeba akakuja naye. Wakati alifika, bibi akakata nyama na akakabula watu wengine na wakapika ile nyama wakakula, na ule mama alipata ugonjwa.
Before long, people in Buende district were falling sick and dying. Numbi would be among the first people on the ground to assess how far the virus had spread. But moving around would prove just as much of a challenge as getting to the infected.
Buende to Kinshasa. Okay, no, I wanted to actually go to Buende.
One of the first people he called was the World Food Programme's Pablo Recalde.
2.4 million square kilometers. That's a continent, guys. To fly from one side to the other to this country takes you 4 hours in a jet plane.
To give you an idea of just how far you'd have to travel to get to Jera County, the location where this latest outbreak began, without a plane, you'd have to travel over 1,000 kilometers to Mbandaka, the capital, then take a barge to Buende, a trip that for the ordinary traveler could take up to 1 week. That's if it isn't raining, which at the time of the outbreak, it was. The World Food Programme was part of a number of organizations led by the DRC government that mounted a response to the outbreak.
We more or less spent $2 to $2.5 million as part of our food and non-food response.
The Congolese government spent a further $3.4 million on the containment campaign. A large amount to be sure, but everyone in the DRC knows just how important it is to get ahead of the spread.
I think that we're better prepared here than in many other parts of the planet, given the fact that it's been recurrent.
Tunazungumuza na wakaji wa kila mgini. Tunabeba chef wa mgini, tunabeba trade practitioner, tunabeba wa social leader, tunabeba wa religious leader, madini yote ile kopale, wa pastori, wa nini. Tunawafundisha kuonesha Ebola ni nini, namna gani wanapaswa kuepuka Ebola, namna gani wanapaswa kufanya kama mtu eko na Ebola.
Already the health areas had some basic function. And had it not been because they were there, it would have actually been much more complicated.
The almost drill-like efficiency with which the DRC ran its containment campaign was something hardly celebrated, although it should have been. 49 people died from the virus, a large number by any standards, but it was contained within 4 months. By December, the DRC had gone 42 days without a single report of the virus. Neither of them are under the illusion that Ebola has disappeared from the Congo. Both nature, the hosts of the virus within the animal kingdom, and nurture, the culture of eating bushmeat, will likely ensure that there will be another outbreak.
We need to change the eating habits of the population. People should eat less, bushmeat. How do you do that in a country which is hungry? When you have areas where people just don't have enough to eat.
A change in tune in eating habits will also be hard to enforce. Above the heads of buyers and sellers at Liberty Market, a loudspeaker blares out an important message. Inside the small office of the market's management, where the public service announcements on Ebola are being played out, are posters telling people what to do in case of Ebola.
Katika Kongo mzima, vile unasema wewe mwenyewe, tunawinda kila siku. Message kubwa ile tunaleta kwa wawindaji wote ni kuonesha kama na kuonesha population ya kama wakati unaenda porini ukikute nyama ameenda polepole, unaona kasha anakimbia kambio sana, unaona makaka anekalake kuna luka kumiti, lakini unaona moja anatembea tu polepole, wakati unamwangalia unaona kama yule nyama eko mgonjwa. Usimguse.
Nyama ng'ombe maya usoma nyama, makaka ng'ombe ya ngoi.
But that message is lost on Mama Maggie's more staunch customers. A bushmeat culture here is more hardwired than you would believe.
I've been eating monkey meat since I was 8 years old. I like it very much. When I cook it, I share it with my family and neighbors.
In many places, bushmeat is the cheapest protein available beyond caterpillar. So in the rural area, in many places in the Congo Basin or in Latin America, 30 to 80% of the protein intake of the population comes from these wild animals or fish. So you cannot tell the people stop eating bushmeat unless you provide them an alternative. The alternative will be domestic livestock, cattle. The problem is that if you take the amount of bushmeat that is eaten in the Congo Basin, which is about 5 million tons per year.
Having seen what it's like in the city, we decided to head out to Bwende, the location of the latest Ebola outbreak, to see whether attitudes towards bushmeat have changed. Bwende, where the more recent Ebola outbreak took place here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is over 1,000 kilometers away, almost impossible to drive towards, and is deep in equatorial forest, thick as you can imagine. And right now it's a rainy season, so even by the standards of the locals, it's very difficult to get to. But we're headed to Bandundu, which is about 500 kilometers away, to see if we can interview people who survived Ebola. We arrive in Kikwit, the capital of Bandundu, and are greeted by this. Sunrises don't come more beautiful than this. A golden awakening to a countryside that is just shaking off the dewy blanket of sleep. 20 years ago, though, Kikwit was host to an Ebola outbreak that shook the world to its core. "175 people died here, and the global medical community dealt with the first bona fide large-scale outbreak of the disease. It was so bad it inspired books, magazine articles dripping with fear, and a Hollywood movie."
In a remote African jungle, a small monkey is captured. Bound for a pet store in America, the animal carries a deadly virus.
Ah, there you are!
Attention, Portland residents.
Today, I'm here to speak to a man who contracted the virus during the time and survived. At Kikwit's Higher Institute for Medical Sciences, I meet Norbert Mabanza. He's a chairperson of the Kikwit Network of Ebola Survivors. He's also a professor at the institute. But 20 years ago, he worked at the one place that would most certainly be a focal point during an Ebola outbreak, at the Kikwit District Hospital.
The first Ebola victim was a hunter who brought home an animal that was infected with Ebola. When he died, members of his family touched his body and they got infected too.
Before long, the woman who had prepared this meal for her family would be brought to the hospital, where doctors misdiagnosed her disease. The worst possible mistake to happen when dealing with Ebola.
All the surgical team apart from the chief surgeon died. I got Ebola from a nurse. She was a nun. She was an Italian. Her name was Clara Angela, who used to work in the operating theater. I used to take blood samples from infected people, so when I drew her blood, I got infected.
When it finally was discovered that it was Ebola that they were dealing with, the hospital was quarantined and Norbert would begin to feel every symptom of the disease through almost all its stages.
Le premier, c'était l'augmentation de la température.
I had a very high fever that did not come down even after I was given medicine.
Ne pouvait pas maîtriser cette fièvre. Après ça, après l'asthénie et...
After the fever and total loss of strength, I had diarrhea and vomited blood.
Du sang, diarrhée, vomissement du sang.
Miraculously, his health turned around after what he said were prayers from a local priest for his health. He would be among 8 survivors. 175 other people who caught the virus would be buried. Many of them met their death here at the Kikwit District Hospital where Norbert got infected. Beyond this wall to my right is the Kikwit General Hospital. Now in 1995, the hundreds of people that were brought from here and surrounding areas suffering from Ebola all died. We're not allowed to film in there today, partly because of the stigma that surrounds Ebola 19 years after that outbreak. It's been 20 years since the outbreak here in Kikwit, but 2 things haven't changed for Norbert. Anytime there's an outbreak of Ebola in the DRC, he says he and his fellow survivors become targets.
My friend had his house stoned once. Villagers also came and burnt his clothes. He and his family were stigmatized. People would accuse them of spreading Ebola.
But perhaps because he knows exactly why he got Ebola in the first place all those years ago, the second unchanging fact to him is about habits in Kikwit, and one of them is their relentless consumption of bushmeat. Telling people to change is one thing. Motivating people to change by offering an alternative is quite another.
It's important to understand the whole value chain between the animal killed or dead in the wood to the carcass or bits sold in the market in town. Because if you want to have an intervention point in the value chain, you need to know who is doing the transportation, who is the wholesaler, who is the detailer, and who is the buyer. Unless you understand that, it's very difficult to act on the value chain. And because the whole value chain on bushmeat is criminalized, nobody is standing up and saying, oh, it's me, I'm transporting the meat.
The drive through Congo's countryside paints part of this picture in beautiful green. Undulating hills of green carpet, and when you stop to admire the view, you often see great black veins of water snaking through many parts of the countryside. All of the elements that a farmer would need. But tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of hectares remain virgin.
There's not only in terms of food. I think the major problem of DRC is that it's too rich, and everybody wants a piece of it. And I think that I would characterize that as the major problem. The conflict, because everyone is here to try to take away part of the wealth that this country has been the same in most of Africa. Most of the countries of Africa have actually suffered the pilferage throughout our history. So I think this is just one of those areas where that has remained, because at the moment there's many people involved in illegal mining, legal or illegal, and of course that has sort of developed into open conflict, which then displaces people. Agriculture needs one thing: peace and security. Otherwise you cannot plant. Agriculture needs roads and markets, and you cannot have roads or markets if you're constantly under fire.
The Congolese government has plans to put millions of hectares of land under irrigation and create special agricultural zones to feed its over 70 million people.
But once this country actually wakes up, then it will be able to feed all of you guys, so you better be kind to them.
But as long as bushmeat is the stronger argument for the Congolese, they will encounter Ebola again. Somewhere down the road, their choice of meat will once again be their fatal poison. Next week, we tell you the rest of that story, continuing our focus on Ebola, also moving through Kenya and Uganda to see the Ebola response this side of the continent, so look out for it. Almost time to wind up the program, but not before we introduce to you, drum roll please, our new segment. We're calling it the X-Edit. Now, we've often got loads of footage that we shoot in the field that just doesn't make it into our cut. And this footage is often very interesting, but I just can't fit it into my script. Now, our cameraman, Sam Munya, who I was with in Kinshasa, who was shooting this documentary on Ebola, set down his camera for once to take a listen and enjoy the music. Sam. You might be behind the camera, but there's a camera behind you as well on the X-Edit. Well, that's where we'll end it this week on Perspective. Thank you very much for joining us on this premiere edition, but you can continue to chat with us online. You can tweet me on my handle @JohnAllenAmu or tweet us on our show handle @KTN Perspective. Remember, everything depends on your perspective. So tilt your head and take a different look, and you might be surprised just what you see. I'm John Allen Amu. Good night.